We feel like we have to be happy and grateful all the time. And there's so many people that are worse off than us.
When we grow up in a culture that tells us that these emotions are bad emotions, it leads to not being able to adapt.
Why is it so important that we feel and embrace the full spectrum of emotions that we're exposed to? And what can happen if we keep suppressing and pushing things down?
So these are such wonderful questions, and there's so many different strands to this answer. The first is that if we think about it at a most basic level, our emotions evolved to help us to adapt. So when we are experiencing, whether it's grief, anxiety, loneliness, sadness, anger, these are actually normal human emotions. And one of the first people who actually spoke about this idea of adaptation through this full range of human experience was none other than Charles Darwin. You know, Charles Darwin describes how our emotions have evolved for two main reasons. The first is to communicate with others. When we are in fear, when we need support, or when someone else is threatening us, we know that we need to now run away or do something different. But the other way that our emotions have evolved is to help us to communicate with ourselves. And what this can mean is if you are a parent who feels guilty, that you might be saying, gee, I value presence and connectedness with my child, and I don't have enough of it. Or if you're in a work situation where you feel like you are just bored, you know, you're super busy, but you're bored because you're not growing anymore, that boredom can actually help you to ready yourself to do something different. Now, when we grow up in a culture that tells us that these emotions are bad emotions, what does it lead to? It leads to not being able to adapt, or my terminology is this terminology around emotional agility. It leads to not being able to be agile. So I've come across countless situations where someone might say, you know, I'm bored in my job, but at least I've got a job. So many people would give anything to have my job. And so they just hunker down and get on with their job. And 5 years later, what have they done? They're still in the same job, and they've lost those 5 years that they could have used to tweak, shape, and understand. So, what actually happens when we suppress our difficult emotions is, and this is not even going to when we try to fake positivity, this is just when we suppress our difficult emotions, is that it actually stops us from being able to understand the signals that our emotions are sending to us about how we might be living in a way that is actually in dissonance with who we want to be, with our values. So that's on a, you know, more macro level. On a more day-to-day level, we know that when people push aside difficult emotions, when they say things like, I feel sad, but I shouldn't be sad, uh, they start engaging in comparative suffering. You know, I'm sad, but I'm not as sad as someone else. Therefore, I don't have a valid reason to be sad, and I push it aside. What it actually does is there's this really interesting rebound effect that happens. We've all had that experience, and I talk about this in my TED talk on emotional courage. If you push aside emotions, it's not like the emotions just go away. Usually, what happens is they actually do the opposite. They become amplified. Psychologists call this emotional leakage. It's a little bit like you've got a delicious piece of chocolate cake in the refrigerator and you try not to think about it. And it doesn't work. You know, the more you try not to think about it, the more it takes outsize proportion in terms of the way you're focusing on it. And so we know that this happens. We try to push these emotions aside, but it doesn't work. And, you know, as I say, that's not even going to now trying to fake positivity, which we can explore if that's of interest. But the psychological cost of faking positivity is really interesting, and I think at a very fascinating level actually lowers our resilience as human beings.
Okay, so, but isn't there an element of faking it till you make it?
If you experience sadness and you are about to go into a job interview because, and that job is important, and you're sad because you've just had a fight with your partner or spouse, there is, of course, nothing wrong in the moment with doing that little bit of emotion suppression and going into the job interview with a smile on your face. What starts to happen, however, is not that in the moment, we start to engage in very often habitual responses to our difficult emotions. So, for instance, we may have been parented in a way that leads us to believe that sadness is bad, okay? Or that anger is bad. Go to your room and come out when you've got a smile on your face. So, what happens in this situation is the psychological messaging that you've got around that emotion is that sadness is bad or anger is bad. When I feel those emotions, I'm uncomfortable with them. So, what I do is I automatically push them away. Or what I do is I don't have the skills to deal with those emotions effectively. And so I actually can get stuck in those emotions. So, what I found in my research is, of course, the in the moment, I'm feeling stressed, but I'm going to just put on a brave face and go and do this particular thing that I need to do right now is not going to cost us. What is going to cost us is when we start defaulting to particular ways of being with our emotions. Those defaults might be actually supported by narratives that we have in society about which emotions are supposedly good or bad. And this can actually lead to profound levels of disintegration. And what do I mean here? As human beings, we have a full range of emotions. We are capacious and beautiful and wise. And we are able as human beings to experience a full range of emotions, not just one emotion or another. When we start having these rules about which emotion is supposedly a good or a bad emotion, we completely narrow our capacity. We don't develop the skills to deal with those difficult emotions. And we start engaging in what I've found in my work and what others have found is, on the one hand, what we call bottling emotions. Bottling emotions is when you push these emotions aside, you say they're bad, they're invalid, I don't have the right to feel them. Or brooding on emotions is where you get so stuck in the emotion that you aren't able to see your child, your partner, your loved one, your colleague, because you're so consumed by the emotion.